Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this webinar from Patient Voice Initiative with Professor Terry Campbell and Hearts for Hearts. I'm joining you today from Brisbane, Australia, which is the land of the Yagara and the Turrbal, and so I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My name's Anne Single. I'm the CEO of Patient Voice Initiative, which is a patient organisation that's interested in how decisions are made in healthcare, especially health technology assessment, and we aim to ensure that patients are seen, heard and valued in healthcare decision making. And the aim of this webinar is to introduce patient communities to the work of the Medical Devices and Human Tissue Advisory Committee, including how it impacts on care you might receive and how you can share your knowledge. The webinar is open to everyone, but we always prioritise the questions of our patient communities. So we ask you to keep your mics off during the webinar. Being school holidays, we're expecting a smaller crowd today, but we also will be recording this session and it will be available on our YouTube page. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Professor Terry Campbell, who's the chair of the Medical Devices and Human Tissue Advisory Committee, and a good friend of Patient Voice Initiatives, Tanya Hall from Hearts for Hearts. But before we get going with presentations, we just wanted to do a little poll just to see who we have online. I wonder, Cecily, can I ask you to launch the poll? Great. So the first question is just, what is your location? You can express it however you like, or if it's not okay for you to share your location, feel free to ignore the question. And then the next question is a little bit about your background. Now, we know that lots of you have multiple hats that you wear, but what's the primary background you'd like to identify? And then finally, and Terry, I'd ask you not to complete this one, how confident would you feel explaining the work of the Medical Devices and Human Tissue Advisory Committee? And we love to capture this one because we'll ask you at the end how confident you feel by the end of the webinar and see whether we were addressing your interests appropriately. I can see a few coming through still, so I'll just give that a moment. I can see we've got patient organisations, we've got 5 from industry, we've got 1 person from government, a researcher, HTA bodies. That's great. And I can see we've got a real range of confidence in the topic, but there's quite a lot of us who are sitting down under 4, and that's absolutely where I'd actually put myself. So I'm hoping by the end of this session that we can pick that confidence up. So we'll end that poll there. And I'll just hit on the share results. I can't see the locations. Can you, Cecily?
Oddly, no. Give me one moment, sorry.
That's all right. I'll leave that to you and we'll keep going, but we will report back sort of where we had people from. And then you could see the variation of people who are here today. And you can also see that some of us are below 4 in kind of what we understand, and some of us have a pretty good understanding. So that should make for a really interesting next hour. So I'm just going back to my notes here. Great. So we're now going to hear about the Medical Devices and Human Tissue Advisory Committee from Terry, and then I'll hand to Tanya for a bit of a Q&A session. So please put your questions into the chat. We're all learning, and so your questions really help us all. As I said, Professor Terry Campbell is chair of the Medical Devices and Human Tissue Advisory Committee, and I'm not reducing it to its initials, partly because I find them harder to say than the full name of this advisory committee. And some of you may have once known this work as the Prosthesis List Advisory Committee, but Terry's going to explain it all. So that committee is within the Australian Department of Health, and Terry's been in that role since 2016. Before that, he served for 15 years on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee. And beyond this service, he's also chair of the Repatriation Medical Authority within GVA. And also, he's a clinical cardiologist who trained in intern medicine and cardiology at St Vincent's Hospital and pharmacology at Oxford University. His own research has encompassed both basic lab research in cardiac pharmacology and clinical cardiology, and he's published over 120 peer-reviewed papers in these fields with more than 5,000 citations of those papers. His long service to improving health includes being Professor of Medicine at St Vincent's Hospital, Sydney, from 1998 to 2017, the Deputy Dean of Medicine at the University of New South Wales, and past President of the Cardiac Society of Australia and New Zealand, and past Deputy of the National Heart Foundation. Terry, with all those accomplishments, I don't know how you found time to join us, but we're very grateful. And so I'd now like to hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Anne, and thanks for the introduction and the invitation. Shall we? I put some slides together. What I propose is to go through them fairly quickly, bearing in mind that we can always come back to them if we need to. At least I hope we can, Cecily, if we need to later. But I'm trying to leave as much time for questions and discussion as possible. We don't need this one. We can move on, thanks, because Anne's just given me an introduction, so you know who I am. Oh, hang on, I'm sorry, I've got the wrong one. Can we go back one, Cecily? Yeah. Okay, so Anne's given you much of this information too. The committee was known for about 10 years as PLAC, from when it was formed during the Howard years at the request of various stakeholders to try and help with negotiations around prices, which in this particular domain are known as benefits for reasons that still escape me. But the benefit is what the private insurance company has to pay if a device is implanted and is on the list. Prior to my appointment, I think it's fair to say there was very little HTA happening in this space. And I have to admit that there has been some more, but not a huge amount more, not because we haven't tried, but because most of the time, and I think this is important to understand, it's a bit of an unusual committee. Or it's an unusual brief, if you like. There are some 11 to 12,000 items on the prosthesis list, as it was known, prescribed list as it is now known. And every meeting, and there are 3 all-day meetings per year, we add a few hundred more of these, but 99% of these applications don't really warrant or get any HTA, because most of them are what we call Me Toos. It's a new screw or a new joint or a new this, that, or the other thing, which is doing pretty much the same as a whole lot of others that are already on the list, and which the sponsor is not requesting a higher price for. And they basically automatically go through without any discussion, and we don't really have any discretion in any case, because legally we kind of have no grounds not to put them on. So whether they want it or not, whether they're filling an unmet need or not, they get on the list. A lot of the time that I spent in the first few years with this committee was actually outside those routine 3 times a year meetings. We're back into that rhythm now, but for several years, which were interrupted quite significantly by COVID, we had a lot of meetings with stakeholders, by which I really mean basically, at times we had consumer reps there, but much of the discussion was between the sort of commercial stakeholders, the private hospitals, the private health insurers, and the sponsors who manufacture or market the devices to try and get some sense into the pricing and to try and deal with the well-known fact. It was well known then, I think it's still well known, that Australia was known in the industry as Treasure Island because we were paying more for devices than most other countries, and sometimes a lot more. There were, of course, exceptions, but it was a problem. And the minister who appointed me, Susan Lee, and the minister that was health minister for most of the time during these reform meetings was Mr. Hunt, were both very keen on getting those prices down. We had long haggles over many meetings over many days and didn't get all that far, I have to confess. The only thing that got prices down, and prices have come down quite significantly, was when the minister basically said the prices are coming down by X. And that worked. It was difficult otherwise. Next slide, thanks. I think, in fact, you can go on too, because the next one's about me, and you already know about me. No, you skipped it. Yeah. So, devices versus medicines. No, come back. Oh, that one. Yeah. So the PBAC, which I spent 15 years on, is probably the closest sort of committee to MDHTAC, but there are differences. Firstly, PBAC basically covers almost all the medicines, prescription medicines that Australians take, whether they're in the public system or the private system, in hospital or out of hospital. MDHTAC is only relevant to the private hospital sector. The first thing the second question I asked when I was asked to chair this committee, then known as PLAC, was what is PLAC? The second question, when that was explained to me, was what's this got to do with the government if it's only in the private hospital sector? And of course, the answer is the subsidies that the government put into private health insurance. So they feel they've got skin in the game and they've got a right to throw their weight around, which is not unreasonable. Public hospitals are irrelevant to what we're discussing today, essentially. If they want devices, and of course they do, they tender for them state by state. And there's various ways they can do that. And if they wish to apply HTA to their decisions, they can. They do sometimes and they don't sometimes. And we're not really talking about that. And they do the same thing, of course, for drugs, for patients who are in hospital. But most drugs, of course, are taken most of the time by patients who are at home. And so there's a huge amount of interest there. Most devices, however, and the ones that are covered by MDHTAC, are put in hospitals. In fact, they have to be put in hospitals or daycare centres to be eligible. So it's a different category. And if you're getting your healthcare from the public system, then this whole discussion is not directly relevant to you. Next, thanks. This is just a couple of slides about the reforms. I've already sort of foreshadowed that we didn't get very far. We got a new name. We got a new name for the committee. It went from Prosthesis List Advisory Committee to Medical Devices and Human Tissue Advisory Committee, and the prosthesis list became the prescribed list. Neither of those really changed much about what we do, although they did change the structure of the committee. And we added at last a consumer rep, and at the moment that's Janet Mumford, who comes along regularly to our meetings. It's still early days in terms of the changes to the committee membership and how we do business, and the NOUS group's currently about 2/3 of the way through a 3-stage evaluation of whether things have changed significantly or not. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so this just talks about the changes again, and I think I can probably skip straight through it. I think we've covered it enough. Next, thanks. This is the government spiel on the purpose of the prescribed list, and I don't mean that sarcastically. That's our purpose, to ensure privately insured Australians who have appropriate health insurance policy get treatment, get covered for treatment, and have access to clinically effective products that meet their healthcare needs. And this is how it's done. I'll go into a little bit more detail in the next few slides on that. Next, thanks. Most of the work is actually not done by my committee, but by my subcommittees. So the subcommittees are the expert clinical advisory groups. They're listed there. in terms of the broad medical surgical areas that they cover. Mostly surgical because we're talking about devices, but the cardiac, and very obviously relevant to Hearts for Heart, devices are often put in by cardiologists, physicians rather than surgeons. There's overlap there. And there's a cardiovascular committee which is chaired actually by cardiologists rather than cardiac surgeon, but it has cardiologists, cardiac surgeons, and vascular surgeons on it. So these are the first filter, if you like, or get the first look at applications after the department has already filtered them once. And I'll come back to that filtering in a minute. They each chaired by somebody eminent in the field, and those chairs are essentially form the largest part of the MDHTAC. Added to those chairs and myself are Jan, our consumer rep, and two more general members, one of whom is a biomedical engineer, a very distinguished biomedical engineer, the other one of whom is an epidemiologist and statistics kind of person. She's a professor from ANU. Next, thanks. So the left-hand stuff, mostly you already know, I think, but we'll go through it quickly. Ministerially appointed committee on the right meets 3 times a year, consists of the chair, I've told you that. We all sign deeds of confidentiality and disclose any conflicts of interest, and they're dealt with ahead of any discussion about the item at issue. And everything's recorded in minutes and advice provided to the sponsor, but at the moment those minutes are not published. We consider eligibility, correctness of the grouping, because the grouping defines the price, basically, is the system that we have. We tried very hard to change that system actually during the reform process, but eventually were ground down by the lawyers and the sponsors and so forth, and it wasn't able to be done. So at the moment, we're still basing prices on groupings. We look at the things you'd expect us to look at making decisions about, should it be on the list and at what price? Next slide, thanks. There are 4 parts, and I don't really think there's much point in going into great depth about these at the moment. Just to let you know, 99% of what I'm talking about and what we deal with is part A, which is the straightforward stuff that I've really been covering. Tiny fraction of it is human tissue products, and I can't actually remember the last time we looked at one of those. Part C is kind of the grab bag exceptions box for things that don't technically fit the rules, but which for various reasons are or are requesting to be put on the list. And part D is a new classification or a new grouping of general use items, which are sort of legacy items, which really are not prostheses, should never have been on the list in many cases, but have been grandfathered, if you like, onto the list. The proposal at the moment is that we won't be adding anything to that list going forward. Next slide, thanks. So to be eligible, you have to be a medical device or a human tissue product. You have to have a Medicare benefit payable. So your device has to be put in by some sort of interventional person, surgeon or physician. And that procedure has to be covered by the MBS and have a Medicare benefit attached to it. And that can lead to delays. If a new device comes along and there's no Medicare benefit, we are legally barred from putting it on our list. It has to be used for or implanted in a patient as part of, so I said that before, it has to be in a hospital or hospital substitute, which are mainly the daycare centres for ophthalmic stuff, for example. And there's a bunch of criteria for listing in the rules, which I'm not going to get into today, at least not in my presentation. Next, thanks. I've mentioned filtering earlier. this is one of the outcomes of the reforms, which I think may have helped. It's a bit early days yet to be sure whether it's really helped. By helped, I mean allowed things to go through more quickly than they previously would have. If your application, and by your, if I'm calling you your, I'm talking to a sponsor really, because really only sponsors can make a formal application to us. If it's a Me Too device, like a new joint or a new screw or nut or bolt, and it does and looks pretty much like all the others that are already on the list, and you don't want any more money for it than the others are getting, then that's tier 1. And in theory, at least, that should be assessed within the department by the department's extremely meagre resources in terms of people, and shouldn't come to us at all. That should, in time, once the department get more and more expertise and more experience at doing this filtering, take about 2/3 of the applications, we hope, 65% of them anyway. So they don't need to go through the committees, which obviously slows them down. If the department can tick them off and say yes without them having to wait for the next meeting, that's great. At the moment, the department's still learning and they're very cautious, and if they've got any doubts at all, they tend to send them to us anyway. So we're still seeing quite a lot of them at the meetings. Then there's tier 2, which is split into 2 parts. So that's something that's got something new about it, that requires at the very least some sort of clinical assessment, clinical data. So the new nut or bolt, if it looks like the others and is made out of the same material, etc., 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 and it's just a different brand, we don't actually ask them to have tried it in 200 patients or whatever over 2 years. TGA looks at whether, it's TGA who decide that it's effective and that it does the job it says it's doing, and we don't second guess that. But if it's doing something new, whoops, we jumped. If it's doing something new, can we go back to the one we were on? Next. That's it. We require clinical information, clinical data, and that can cause trouble sometimes. And tier 2B, if they're asking for a higher price, for example, then that's where HTA comes in, and we tend to outsource our HTA usually to professional analysts in various groups that you probably know of yourselves around the country, particularly in Sydney University and in Adelaide. Tier 3 is something brand new. An example of that would be, for instance, in the cardiac sense, something that was coming in and seeking a place on the list when I first became chair, and that was the transcutaneous aortic valve replacements, which have now become very commonly used and very popular. When that first arrived, that would clearly be tier 3. It's a brand new technology. The idea wasn't around before, the concept wasn't around before. That needs a full evaluation, and it's done in it's done by MDHTAC basically, who at the same time are generally looking at the procedure for putting it in as well. So MDHTAC will look at it, come up with what they say is a cost-effective price for the device, and they'll also come up with a proposed payment for the procedure as well, an MBS item, in other words. Okay, so this is still relatively new, and how well this is going to, or how much more smoothly this is going to make things move through the system, I think remains to be seen. Next, thanks. I won't go into the detail on here because we're going to run out of time if I try and do that. I've already sort of covered enough of that, I think. So next. Tier 1, examples of devices recommended. I'm happy for these slides to be made available, so probably just, is that okay? If we don't go through them now, we just make them available. People actually want to look at that list, they can do so offline. Next, thanks. Tier 2, devices not suitable. two routes. So there's a number of ways in which you can become tier 2. So I fibbed when I said a joint would get on there because on tier 1, because it would come to tier 2, even if it was very much the same as others. I don't know that we need to go through any of that, but obviously if the sponsor's asking for more, then it's a different matter. So one of the criteria for listing is the medical device must be assessed so it's not inferior or no less clinically effective than the alternative devices. And the benefit must be proportional to the clinical effectiveness of the device. This is where HTA can come in, and this is where, if it's unclear what that benefit should be, we send it off for a focused HTA. Or if it's brand new technology, it's tier 3 and we send it to MDHTAC. Okay, next, thanks. These are some things, examples of the kind of clinical data we might request, and it's only meant to be notional. Please don't take it as literally, 250 is enough and 249 is not, for example. Next, thanks. This is detailed and probably more detailed than we need for today's discussion, so I'll just go on to the next slide. I think you can read that in your own time if you like. And then tier 3 I've pretty well explained already. You can apply if sponsors, we know sponsors don't like going to MDHTAC because it takes so long. We also know that's being reviewed at the moment, and that's in a whole nother story for another day. But so sponsors tend to be a little bit loath to say I'm tier 3, but in some situations it's so obvious that they really just have to say let's submit it as a tier 3. Other times it may have been submitted as a tier 2 and they've been told, well, no, actually it's going to have to go tier 3. And if it goes tier 3, then it's really over to MDHTAC rather than us. Next, thanks. And that's it. I'll just leave those slides in the back. Hang on to those slides and send them around by all means otherwise. But I'll stop there and see what people would like to ask about what we do.
Thank you very much,
see whether
Terry.
I can answer them.
That's right. But we really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to hand over to our moderator, Tanya Hall, and for our question and answer part. I think a lot of you know Tanya, but for those of you who don't and haven't met her, she's the incredible CEO of Hearts for Heart. And through her own experience of living with congenital heart disease and arrhythmias, Tanya founded Hearts for Hearts in 2011 as the national organisation supporting, educating and advocating for Australians and New Zealanders living with heart disease. And now Hearts for Hearts is widely consulted in the field of education, support and advocacy for patients by stakeholders across research, government, industry and not-for-profit. Tanya is currently also a member of the World Heart Federation Board, representing the Australian heart community and advising on the lived experience perspective. Tanya, thank you for joining us today. Apologies for my croaky voice. Tanya, we focus a lot on medicines and diagnostics at Patient Voice Initiative, as Terry alluded to, but we know that medical devices matter to your community and to others. And so now that we've heard from Terry, we'd love to hear your questions and also questions from those who've joined us online.
Thank you. And thank you, Anne, for including us in this webinar. And thank you, Terry, for your comprehensive presentation. Look, so we do have a couple of questions for you. What does the committee regard as important when considering lived experience in health technology assessment?
It's not actually something that comes up very often, to be fair. If it's a brand new technology, then that will have been sort of looked at through MDHTAC. And if it's not, then generally speaking, it's kind of assumed because if it's not, then almost always it's going to be similar devices already available. And we are looking for any kind of evidence that the new device is at least as good as the others in terms of whatever outcomes the sponsor can give us. And it's really quite difficult often to get, because, when I was in PBAC, we used to sometimes complain about the quality of data provided on new drugs. But, they look, like absolute paradigms compared to a lot of the applications that we get for new devices. Because this sort of second stage that we do, looking at the HTA after TGA is a bit unusual around the world. Generally speaking, if you get your device through the FDA or the equivalent in Europe, then that's it. You can market it. We've added this extra space, and the sponsors often haven't collected data aimed at getting it through the requirements of MDHTAC. So I'm waffling because there isn't a specific column for lived experience. Maybe there should be, and happy to talk about it, but I assure you that if there were, it would generally be blank in terms of what we get.
I know, yes, I understand, and it's the challenge, I suppose, that we've had. Obviously, you know us well. We've certainly provided input into applications because it's very relevant for our community.
Sure.
And so in the cases that you do, could you explain how the committee considers and includes patient testimonies in new technology appraisals?
We don't get them much. The CAGs may get more, and they certainly look at that. They also get testimonials from doctors saying, we want this. We'll look at it, but it's really hard data as to whether it works or not and how well that we're interested in. And generally speaking, the technology is new enough that it's hard to get much more than that.
Sure.
I mean, I'd be delighted if we could, do a comprehensive, patient-related outcomes, PROMs and all the rest of it type analysis, but we just don't usually have the data on which to do it. The thing's brand new. It's not been in the country before. It's very hard to get it.
Thank you. And so, in your role as chair on the committee, how easy is it to consider each stakeholder equitably when undergoing assessment of new healthcare options?
Oh, impossible. I mean, that's why Sam Dastiari called it a circular firing squad. I mean, the whole rationale, as I understand it, and I wasn't around then in this space, but when it was set up, was because each sponsor thought each stakeholder, and I'm deliberately leaving consumers out now because I think they pretty much were left out at the time. I'm talking about private hospitals, health insurers, and manufacturers, and they're each complaining that we're being bullied by the other two. Please help us. It was in the context, the early 2000s, prices and the spend on the PL was going up vertically, because basically the sponsors were naming the price and nobody was arguing hard enough with them to have any control over it. And certainly the introduction of the original PLAC committee did slow that right down quite significantly, and then it gradually started to creep up again. But it's impossible. I mean, each of the stakeholders wants, the max for them. The sponsor wants the highest price they can get. The hospitals want the lowest price we can get for them or that they can negotiate. And ditto the insurers, who will tell you, as it's public knowledge, insurers are always telling us how their costs are going up and they can't keep the premiums down and so on and so forth. So it's a series of compromises, and it's trying to come to some sort of agreement. And as I said, it's not been easy to do. And to be honest, HTA has had very little success in doing much of it in the past. I think I'm right in saying, and it's still too early to be confident about that it will have more to do with how we come to a price in the future. Certainly sponsors are starting to understand that we expect cost effectiveness information and we are going to take it into account. But in terms of getting the prices down from where they were in the stratosphere to where they now are, the only thing that worked was basically mandate by government, which was what essentially came out of the reforms. They eventually managed to get hold of the prices that were being paid by the state jurisdictions for the same device, and in a way that kept it blind, those prices blind to everybody, because it was done by IPA or whatever it's called these days, the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority. It's got a new extended name, but that's the same group. They kind of kept it all to themselves. And they came up with a price that was an average price that was being paid by the state jurisdictions. And then the government said in stages, the gap, if there was one, and to be fair, there wasn't always, but there usually was quite a big gap between what's paid in the private sector on the PL and what's paid by the public hospitals, has to be closed. And it was closed in various stages, and that's still happening, but certainly managed to get the price down a bit. But that has nothing to do with HTA, really.
Can I jump in with a question? Oh, sorry, Tanya.
No, go ahead.
I can wait my turn. Okay. I was just going to say, I found this fascinating because no wonder it's hard for us to make sense of it on the outside, because it is complicated. And I really appreciate you offering to share those slides with us, because I think it will be nice to look through them. But I was interested because I saw that you had Jan Mumford, who many of us know as a consumer member. And I remember years ago, Janie Whale, who many of us know as well, was on the prosthesis list. And I wondered, what's the role for the consumer member on those committees?
You really should ask Jan that. It's very limited, and it's very limited for the reasons that I said. 99% of our decisions are basically no-brainers, in the sense, no-brainers is probably the wrong term, but we don't have any discretion. So whether consumers want it or not, or whether they like it or not, if it ticks the boxes, we have to let it through. So there's not a lot of point having long agonized discussions over which one's better than the other. And the theory is put them all out there and let the surgeons and their patients decide which ones they wish to use. Every now and then, and it certainly would have happened, but it would have happened at MSAC before my time, with the TAVI, for example, the aortic valve things. I'm sure that those sorts of discussions were held then. We don't often have one, or haven't often had one in my time. But Jan certainly asks sensible questions about things that are relevant to patients, and she certainly has her say.
Oh, that's really helpful. Tanya, have you seen the question in the chat? Or I can read it out if you haven't. Sorry, I know we've got a lot of things on our screen. So there's a question there that firstly says, many thanks for the presentation, ! I think we've all been wanting to hear this. And then it says, are the MDHTAC agendas published, and how would a patient group know to provide input if it is sought via the lived experience person on the committee, or how does that work? Thanks, Lee, for that question.
Yeah, I'm not sure how well I can answer that, to be honest. No, they're not published. There's a whole lot of commercial and confidence stuff going on here. Jan gets them, but she's sworn to secrecy, as it were. The sponsors don't like them published, because if they're published and then it doesn't appear on the PL, that means it's been turned down, and sponsors don't especially like that being public knowledge. So at the moment, it's not a very public process. I concede that.
It's good to understand that.
I think you'll find groups like Tanya's will know what's coming up, though, because they talk to the sponsors behind the scenes, and quite legitimately, and so they'll know when things are coming. But the sponsor has to put that information out there. As I understand it, we can't.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in here. Thank you again, Terry. I think you've really talked to, because this is it's so complicated and very different than I suppose how many other patient organisations provide input into PPAC applications, MSAC and so forth, and this is a very different and much more complicated beast. How can the patient voice align better or be better incorporated with the agenda of the committee?
It's going to be difficult, but I'm happy to have discussion about it. I think the short answer is going to be not very much, really. Joe Watson, might be worth having a chat with about how it can be done. But as I say, the agendas aren't public. So you'd need, the patient advocacy groups would need to work through the sponsors to see what, presumably when something new comes along, like for example, at the moment, the new valve, mitral and tricuspid valves and so forth, you'll know about that. You'll be talking to sponsors about that. They'll tell you if they wish to, when their applications are coming up. But it's not easy. I mean, I'm very open to talking about it, but I'm having trouble seeing exactly how much difference it would really make to our decisions.
I think I was just going to say,
know that the things are wanted because they're being used and demanded. Sorry, Anne, go on.
no, you're right. Apologies for speaking over. I always misjudge timing online. I think it's useful to understand the challenges at the MDHTAC base, and also to think about how can we work with sponsors on that evidence base around lived experience too. I just noticed that we had 2 people with hands up. Thank you so much for waiting. We are a small group, so Nikki, if you want to come online to say your question, we'd love to hear it.
Great, thanks, Anne, and thank you, Terry. That's very, very helpful. My question sort of leverages off like the discussion around how patients get heard. If a patient group feels that a device is not being used according to the guidelines or to the description, and there's risk for them, so how would they be able to raise that, and where does that fit in? Because it might be more around that description in the MBS item that needs to be tightened. Is there the ability for a patient group to come forward and say, how do we take that up?
Well, they wouldn't come generally to us. I mean, if you're worried about safety, it's TGA that you talk to.
Yeah, but if
you're worried about them being used off-label, well, I'm just not quite sure what the
I think that the MBS item, how it's described,
the descriptor they call that,
is quite open, and so in some hospitals they will use one kind of device, and in another hospital they will use another, and so one gives better care to women and the other gives less.
Okay, well, I mean,
care.
I know it sounds like I'm washing my hands, but I really am. That's nothing to do with us. And I don't particularly like that aspect of it, but legally that's the situation. We say it's good enough, but so are half a dozen other things. And if it's something cardiac, for example, I might have my own views as to whether, okay, all right, it's probably good enough, but that one's probably better. That nobody's got the really good data to show that. It's not my business to get involved in who uses what. The theory is it's decided by the surgeon and their patient. And if you think there's something going on that shouldn't be going on, then healthcare complaints or the department, that our committee doesn't have any jurisdiction over that sort of thing.
Great, thank you, Terry. That's very helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, great to understand. I could get Tanya to ask Caro, but I think I'll ask Caro for her question.
You're on mute, Caro.
Love that. I said all the great things just then. Thank you so much, Terry. That was a great presentation and some really useful insight working in this space. I think it sounds like there's potentially a bit of an opportunity to have a broader conversation here about how lived experience could be incorporated a little more. I'm really interested. I suppose there's two parts to my question. You have a huge expertise behind you on your CV and your resume. From the experience of perhaps some of your other roles that you've played, also in your clinical cardiologist role, can you think of any examples where you've seen a really powerful patient testimony or lived experience that's actually been change making, that's really kind of added value to a conversation or a decision being made?
To be honest, no. It's very useful in terms of the next phase, which is, okay, you've got your listing on the PL. What's going to happen? Which one's actually going to be chosen from the variety that might be available on the PL? And that's the sort of setting where that would happen. And that, to my mind, is generally, and yes, I get involved in it too. I have done in the past. I'm mostly retired from most of that sort of stuff now, but that will be decided by, the heart group at the hospital or by the cardiac society's guidelines, things like that. We're not a guideline setting committee. We're not telling surgeons which device to use or when to use it. We're just saying, if you wish to do operation X, then you may use A, B, C, or D, and while we're not saying they're identical, we're saying they're all good enough to be on the list for Australian patients. And we just don't get into it. I have been involved in that sort of thing in the past. And yeah, patient experience will come into it then. Although generally it's been filtered through the patient's surgeons rather than directly from the patients. And, happy to talk about ways and means of expanding that. But that's really a different subject for discussion. In terms of deciding whether it gets on the list or not, as I say, it's usually not really the fact that the patient experience is positive is usually taken for granted when it's got to the stage of being considered for going on the PL. Maybe that's wrong, and maybe we need to have another think about that. But we're really looking at does it work as well as the competitors, or if there are no competitors, does it work in terms of whatever the new procedure is there? And we don't have a formal mechanism for asking patients at this stage other than through Jan. And I'm sure she will tell us if there were lots of noises, but maybe we should be being more proactive about asking for noises to be made.
Sure. And we're very much involved, which I'm sure you're aware of, a lot of the reforms that are ongoing at the moment around this space, particularly with PBAC and MSAC and the ongoing.
Oh yeah, no, I'm involved in those. Yeah, the stuff that Andrew Wilson's trying to
and we would love
change,
to.
But it's mostly focused on drugs at the moment. I've been to a bunch of those meetings, and all they ever talk about is drugs, which is great, and I understand that. It's a much bigger area that, to work on than devices, and there's probably more scope for improving quality of life that way as well.
Of course. I mean, perhaps we can look at some of the things that, we're kind of exploring with them in terms of feedback and that involvement of the consumer and how that process happens and the transparency, etc. So we'd love to continue that conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Sure.
Absolutely. And I think, Terry, when thinking about an example, I think many years ago when you and I interacted was about the catheter ablation, and obviously we were involved in advocating for that to be listed. And I think the fact that there sort of wasn't any clear pathway for patient input certainly made it very difficult. Yeah.
That's a good example. See, I mean, that was a policy issue. Basically, these ablation catheters were not then and still are not technically prostheses, and therefore we couldn't put them on the list. I couldn't act on that until the minister, it was Minister Hunt, wrote me a letter basically saying put them on the list, and we did. But that's Part C. That's what Part C is about. Now, you can argue that our definition of a prosthesis is wrong, and that's fine. I'm happy to have that discussion all day long. I accept it as completely arbitrary, but it is what it is. And if you want it changed, then the people to lobby are not my committee, but the government, to get them
That's
to
good
change their
advice.
policy. We're an implementation of policy committee. We do not make policy. And if I start trying to make policy, I'll be jumped on from a great height, I'm sure. So
That's such a
my
useful
attitude,
commentary. Yeah,
sorry?
sorry. I was saying that's such a useful comment because often in patient community, knowing who we speak to
Yeah,
about
you need
what
to know
is
who to
really
talk to.
important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And talking
And
to us is a waste of time if you want to get some new widget on the PL that is not a prosthesis as defined. You need to lobby. You need to get the interest. Well, firstly, you need to have a sponsor behind you, obviously, who's willing to put the effort into it. But they really need to lobby the government and ultimately the minister to say, you know, there's no way of funding this, because if it's not on the PL and it's being used, and there are a lot of things that fall into that category, you know, sutures and God knows what else, which adds up to a lot of money. But that's all wrapped up in the funding arrangements for private hospitals. So that's where a lot of stuff is paid for. And if these things are being used at the moment in private hospitals, and that was the counter argument to Tanya's thing about the ablation catheters were being used, she would argue quite rightly they weren't being used as much as they could have been, but they were being used, and ergo somebody was paying for them. And that varied, but usually it was private health insurers sort of compassionate things or whatever, or the patients were paying themselves, I presume. I don't really know. So you need to lobby the people who can actually make the change. And that's going to usually be if the sponsors want it to happen. If they don't want it to happen, then there's not much you can do. But if the sponsors want their things on the PL, then we need to get the politicians involved. You know,
That's really great advice, Terry, and because essentially the purpose of this webinar is to educate others and other patient organisations, and to learn, you know, how to approach it if there are any barriers in their own, you know, cohort of diseases that they're advocating for, and it was very complicated way back then, but absolutely there is a role for us. Certainly.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the two big barriers are either it's out of scope for us, and the only way of getting it in scope is for the Minister for Health to tell us, make an exception, which is what happened there, or the sponsor or somebody, usually the sponsor, is asking for more than we think it's worth. And that's where, if that were to happen, and I can't think of an actual case, but if that were to happen, that might be where patient advocacy might make a difference. Because obviously these are negotiations ultimately. You do the mathematics and you come up with a number, but then you can negotiate around it. And if the patients say, oh, well, we don't really care, then obviously we wouldn't back down. If a lot of patients wrote and said, you know, we do care and we really need this because, and provide some lived experience data, for example, then we might be prepared to, you know, make exceptions or allow for a higher benefit than we otherwise would. That's the sort of setting. But for that argument to even happen, the device in question would have to be eligible for the PL, and the issue would not be eligibility, the issue would be price, which is the same with PBAC, of course, and there's so much publicity going on about that at the moment.
Oh, look, thank you so much, Terry. I'm watching the time, and I'm
Sure.
also seeing the comments that people are making, just saying how valuable they've found this discussion. I wonder, Cecily, if you would start our poll to see how people are feeling on their confidence now. And Tanya, did you want to make any final comments while people were completing that poll?
Yeah, look, I mean, I just like to thank Terry so much for your time. It really is complicated. And I mean, even, we're trying to teach others in our community how to use their voice and be involved and to understand the healthcare system. And this is particularly complex. So I think this is going to be really useful for our community. Just before we finish off, though, I just have one final question for you. If there is a sort of main piece of advice that you have for patients and patient advocates for having their voice heard, what would that be?
Oh, find or found a patient advocacy group, I would think, because an individual patient writing in even 2 or 3 sort of separate missives isn't going to have much influence. But groups like yours are going to have much more influence, and also people like yourselves are able to advise people, about how to go about it. Generally speaking, I mean, having spent nearly 30 years now on these HTA committees, it's rare. I understand people often talk to us, patients and sponsors, and kind of talk to us as if we don't get that patients really want this and really need it. We actually generally do get that. It's kind of taken as read. If it weren't the case, then we wouldn't really be having a lengthy discussion. It would be quite an easy decision to make. So while I'm probably sounding a bit negative about patient input, it's only because, in a sense, it's adding to something that 99 times out of 100 we already know anyway.
Thank
It
you.
would be
Thank
very
you,
helpful
Terry.
if it was negative input and there were problems that we weren't aware of that patients were. That would also be helpful in terms of making decisions.
I find that comment really useful to Terry about that people on committees start with an assumption that the community may want something, because even into MDHTAC or PBAC, when people are giving input, we often at Patient Voice Initiative encourage people to understand that that is the basis, but actually for those committees, you need to be able to put forward information that's additional knowledge to what will be in the other evidence. So I really appreciate your candidness today and the explanation, because it is completely different over at MDHTAC, which I'm getting better at saying. So that's one immediate
Give it its
outcome
full
from
name by all means.
from it. And I can also see that although we're just getting a small number on the poll, we can see that we've moved out from being down in that bottom section where I guess quite a few of us felt we were. And so I really appreciate that. I'm just going to quickly share my screen
Sure.
to formally say thank you very much, Professor Terry Campbell. We really appreciate you making time for this today. We know it's a super different topic for us to explore, and so we're also really grateful for you for sharing those slides, and we can link those to those who participated in the meeting. We've also just put on this slide here a QR code so that you can go to the web pages for the committee, and you can mark those if you want to have a little further look there. Patient Voice Initiative receives sponsorship from a variety of pharmaceutical companies. And so I just want to acknowledge our sponsors who help us keep going, and we're really grateful to that. I want to say a huge thank you to Hearts for Hearts, who brought this topic and really raised it to our interest and made sure that even though we found it complicated, we found a way and we found the person to help us understand more. And we're really grateful to you at Hearts for Hearts for working with us. And finally, I just want to show this slide. We talked a few times during this webinar about giving patient input to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee or to the Medical Services Advisory Committee. And you can always check out our resources by following that QR code or email us about anything. I'm just going to flick back as well so that you can catch the Hearts for Hearts email, because Terry gave some great advice there about work through your patient organisations on this matter. They're there. This is what they get out of bed for, whether they want to get out of bed or not. They get out of bed to do this work. So do check in with them. And with that, I'll thank everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar.